Chapter 091 A Path Paid in Blood. This isn't going to work. Zorian stopped staring at the pile of blueprints and notebooks in front of him and looked at the speaker. It was Xvim. He and Alanik had snuck up to him while his attention was absorbed into his task and were currently staring at him expectantly. Zorian tapped his pen on the table a couple of times before throwing it aside and leaning back in his chair. Perhaps it would be a good idea to take a break. His work had stalled for a while now. "I'm not sure I understand," he told his old mentor. "We can't keep going like this," Xvim clarified. "This path we're on, it's not going to work. When we planned this out, we were counting on having Silver Lake on our side. Now we don't, and no amount of increased enthusiasm and minor adjustments is going to make up for it. I know you're still under the impression of what Benaxeth told you, but something has to change. At this rate we're simply blundering into an obvious failure." Zorian stared at Xvim for a second before glancing at Alanik. However, the scarred battle priest was silent, simply staring back at him without saying a word. Clearly he agreed with Xvim's words, then. They had probably discussed things between each other before approaching him. He looked around the room instead of immediately answering. It gave him a way to stall and gather his thoughts, but he was also curious about people's reactions to the conversation. They were inside one of the Nevada Estate's rooms, and there were quite a few people gathered here. Most of them pretended to be absorbed into their own work, but Zorian could tell that all of them were paying close attention to what was happening. Well, except for Zack. His fellow time traveler was sitting cross-legged on the floor with his eyes closed, trying to sense the divine energies of his divine blessing and controller marker. Zorian was not sure why he was doing that, to be honest. Both he and Zack had already succeeded at perceiving these divine energies, and it was unlikely he would develop the skill much in what little time they had left before the end of the restart. On top of that, they had basically given up on trying to modify the temporary markers. There was little point to that now. He took a deep breath but resisted the urge to sigh. They had informed the whole group about their second encounter with Benaxeth and what it meant for Zorian. Strangely, the group took another bout of bad news in stride. In fact, the knowledge that Zorian now shared fates with them seemed to significantly improve the mood of the group. He was one of them now, and the fact that he didn't panic and break down after finding out this was his last chance to live seemed to inspire them somewhat and calm their fears. They worked harder, grumbled less, and were less dubious about his motives and logic. For a while, he thought it would be enough. That with some renewed enthusiasm and some clever workaround they would be able to make up for Silver Lake's absence and proceed as planned. However, Xvim and Alanik were right. This wasn't going to work. They needed a new plan. "What are you suggesting?" Zorian asked them. "First of all, we should tell Cranton and his team that we're time travelers," Xvim said. Zorian cocked his head to the side curiously. Not really what he was expecting to hear. "Wouldn't that be rather counterproductive?" Zorian asked. "Cranton and his team have been remarkably cooperative with us, all things considered. If they knew the truth, I imagine their enthusiasm for helping us could only plummet as a response." "I said we should tell them we're time travelers, not the full and total truth," Xvim said. "Truthfully, they already suspect this. The documents we are providing them with are too similar to their own existing work for that to escape their notice. They have been talking amongst themselves about our identity for a while now, and the most common theory is that we are literally from the future. It isn't that far from the truth, really. They actually hit upon such a crazy theory as the most likely one?" Zorian asked, surprised. "They are working in a time magic research facility," Xvim said. "Even though actual time travel is said to be impossible, The topic is likely to come up with some regularity among the staff. They are being paid to push the boundaries of time magic as much as they can, after all. Zorian stayed quiet for a few seconds, mulling things over. He supposed the idea was workable, all things considered, and it might eliminate some of the inefficiencies they'd encountered when working with Cranton and his team. However, although this would be useful, I'm not really sure it would do that much, Zorian said finally. The facility staff is already working hard on the project of turning the Imperial Orb into a black room. Even with their limited information, they seem appreciative enough for the funding and opportunities we've given them. I doubt we could drive them to work harder with this. No, probably not, Xvim agreed, propping his elbows on the table and folding his fingers into a triangle shape in front of him. This is merely an attempt to make them fine with the second step of the plan. Which is? Zorian prompted, feeling just a little bit apprehensive all of a sudden. Kidnapping everyone skilled and possibly useful and forcing them to work for us, Xvim stated calmly, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Must resist the urge to sigh. Must resist the urge to sigh. Must resist. Zorian rubbed his chin in a frustrated manner before focusing back on the two people in front of him. Alanik was still not saying anything. They were both staring at him and waiting for a response. And just how Zorian began. Through any means necessary, Xvim said, cutting him off. Blackmail. Threats of death and bodily harm. Rampant use of mind magic. My mind magic is not that capable, Zorian said, frowning. The kind of work we need from them has never been done before. They would need to work with us to invent entirely new spells and rituals. I know, Xvim said. I can't force someone to perform creative work for me with mind magic, Zorian pointed out. I don't think anyone can. At best we'd get a bunch of dazed zombies. They don't know that, though, Xvim said. Mind magic is terrifying, even for mages, and few people are experienced enough to guess your limits. Ignoring that, what you can do is already terrifying enough for most people. If you demonstrated your memory manipulation abilities, most people would be very intimidated. Even I'm afraid of you sometimes, and I'm both familiar with your limitations and relatively certain you will not target me with your abilities. Finally, even if someone is not intimidated by your ability, you can always use your memory modification abilities as a limited retry button for convincing people. You've used your powers in that manner before, I am told. But only on enemies, stressed Zorian. And I'm very grateful you retain that sense of morality and restraint in regards to your powers, Xvim said patiently. But we're running out of time and desperate times call for desperate measures. Don't think we're just selfishly asking you to discard your ideals. This is a burden we're all willing to take upon our shoulders. Zorian gave him a surprised look. Somebody will need to keep this mass of resentful, forcibly recruited mages in line and focused on their duties instead of plotting our downfall, Xvim said. That's going to be our job. Your job is simply to gather the people we need and intimidate them into cooperating with us, however reluctantly. Zorian stared at the man for a while, considering what he had been told. Xvim was essentially saying that all or most of the other temporary loopers already agreed that this was an acceptable course of action. That they were just going to kidnap random people and force them into working for them. And here Zorian was thinking he was being too carefree about reaching for the darker, unethical methods to tackle their problems. Well, he said. I see we're turning into a proper villainous organization. All we need now is a mystical artifact that will allow us to remake the world in our image and we're set to go. Xvim's lips twitched slightly. If you really think about it, he said, a large group of people armed with knowledge of things to come and all the things we've gathered in the time loop would be more than enough to— Please don't, Zorian implored him. Just Tell me once again how this is supposed to work." "All right," Xvim said, reaching into his bag and handing him a map with a bunch of locations marked on it. Colorful paper notes densely filled with text were pinned next to each of the indicated locations. "Our main problem right now is that we don't have enough time," Xvim continued after Zorian had a chance to glance at the map. "The only way we're going to get that is by pushing our Black Room modification project to its utter limit. Therefore, we should drop virtually everything and focus on that. However, the biggest problem the project has is the lack of qualified mages to work on it. Most of us are not really qualified to help with it. However, this facility is not the only one of its kind. There are other facilities in other countries, and though they have not gotten as far as the one in Eldamar, their staff is no less qualified than Cranton and his researchers. They just suffer from the lack of funding and opportunities." The places on the map marked with blue upturned triangles were locations of all known Black Room projects in Altasia, Zorian realized. He knew about these, of course. They had been making use of their facilities for quite some time now. Not just in the sense that they were using them to extend their time in the restarts, either. They had long ago raided these places for any information about time magic, as well as handed them collected research notes from other facilities to see if they would come up with something novel when presented with such information. Although these initiatives were moderately successful, they had stopped yielding results by now, and so they no longer bothered with them. They simply made use of the facilities in each restart and then left them alone. Although these places were much smaller than the time magic research facility beneath Seoria, there was a fair number of them. If they forcibly took all their staff, that would be a lot of people. Plus, there might be some useful equipment there, now that he was thinking about it. If they were raiding these places for people, they might as well take everything that wasn't nailed down as well. So we just raid those places, taking everything and everyone in sight, Zorian said, clacking his tongue. What about those who just won't cooperate, no matter what carrot and stick we use? Kill them? Push them through a portal to Blantyre and strand them in the jungle for a while, Xvim said. I think most will reconsider after a few days, but if not, they can just spend the rest of the month there. And probably get eaten by a flying snake or something, Zorian thought, though he did not say it out loud. In any case, with the sudden influx of new people and with Cranton's hopeful acceptance of our time traveler story, we can then move on to the next step, said Xvim, handing him another map. This one was a very detailed map of the underworld beneath Seoria, centered around the time magic research facility. However, the facility in the map Xvim gave him was larger than the one that currently existed beneath their feet. Much, much larger. It was a huge, sprawling complex that circled the whole like a giant torus and then extended into the surrounding land through a spider web of rooms and corridors. Zorian gave Xvim a dubious look. There is no way this kind of development can be hidden from the city, Zorian said dubiously. Never mind Cranton and his reaction, this would bring the Eldamar military on our heads. Do we really have enough influence to make the city authorities overlook this sort of thing? Yes, that is certainly a problem. Xvim tapped his fingers together and looked away uneasily for a second. We think we have a solution for that, though. I'm not going to like this, am I? Zorian asked rhetorically. Can't it really be worse than the whole mass kidnapping thing? We should work with the Esoteric Order of the Celestial Dragon and its leaders, Xvim told him. Zorian scowled at the suggestion. He had nothing but disgust and contempt for the cult of the World Dragon. At least the Ibisons had a relatively understandable goal of sabotaging their national enemies. The cultists were traitors and seemed to operate purely on a mixture of delusion and insatiable greed for power. Most of the lower-level members didn't even know what exactly they were fighting for. Plus, He could never quite forget the sight of the shifter children they sacrificed in order to crack open Panaxith's prison. He did not like the idea of cooperating with these people in the slightest. "You can't be serious," Zorian told him, voice tinged with annoyance. "I really am serious. And not just because they can help us make the city authorities look the other way while we rearrange the local underworld in our favor. With the loss of Silver Lake, we have lost our expert on the primordials and their cages. Aside from Silver Lake, the cult's leaders are probably the people most qualified to help us understand Panaxith's prison. And how to exploit it to get out of the time loop," Xvim explained. "We already took everything they had," Zorian pointed out. In fact, they had been exceptionally thorough in raiding the cult for every secret they had. Zorian may have compunctions about delving into the minds of random people to steal their secrets, but he had no such compunctions about the cultists. He could not claim to have gotten every scrap of knowledge they had, since he could only look for things if he knew what to look for, but he was quite sure he got everything truly important out of them. "What they already have, yes," Xvim said. "But not what they could have, if we teach them all we know and give them a chance to look at the problem with increased skills and perspective." Zorian's eyes widened in realization. "You want to teach them?" he asked, aghast at the idea. "Everything, yes," Xvim confirmed, nodding. "We would not inform them about the time loop, of course, but other than that, we will bring them into our improved Black Room and teach them everything we can about divination, about dimensionalism, and about the structure of the primordial prison in the whole. We will then let them analyze the structure and either ask them to answer our questions or you can just rip the answers straight out of their minds. It depends on how cooperative they are and what is more convenient." Zorian remained silent for a while. On one hand, he really didn't like the idea of teaching these people anything, especially since that would involve them being close by for several months, plenty of time for things to go seriously wrong. On the other hand, he found the idea of the cultists unknowingly helping them get out of the time loop so they could sabotage their plans in the real world to be rather amusing. And Xvim was right that, other than Silver Lake, these people were the ones most familiar with the Primordials prison. They had been studying it for quite a while now in their attempt to open it, after all. There was, of course, a small matter of why in the world would the cult leaders agree to work with them on this. However, they were already considering kidnapping people and using blackmail and intimidation to make them cooperate, so this was probably not as difficult of an issue as it appeared. They just had to point out that the invasion could not possibly succeed unless Zack and Zorian allowed it to happen, and then prove their words with a demonstration of their power. He looked at Alanik, who had still not said anything up until now. "I'm surprised you're willing to entertain this idea," Zorian told him. "I was willing to work with Silver Lake, wasn't I?" Alanik said. "She may not have done anything particularly heinous in front of you, but I assure you she has done plenty of odious deeds in the past. I understand the necessity. It would be playing with fire, but it isn't like this is the first time we're doing that. Isn't it?" "Indeed," Zorian said quietly. He paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts. Alanik never really talked about his past with Silver Lake, or of his time before he became a priest. Zorian had long figured out by now that the scarred battle priest had been a very different man back then, and did a lot of things he later regretted, so he refrained from pushing the men on the topic. Alanik had been incredibly helpful towards him throughout all these restarts, and Zorian felt it would be ungrateful of him to dredge up painful memories and old grudges unless he really had to. If Alanik had some information about Silver Lake that he felt was important, he would have told them about it by now. After a while, Zorian picked up a pen and threw it at Zack's head. Though he had his eyes firmly closed, Zack immediately raised his hand and caught the pen out of the air before opening his eyes. "How much did you hear?" Zorian asked him. "Most of it," Zack admitted. "And?" Zorian prompted. "What do you think?" "I don't have any better idea," Zack said with a shrug. Neither did Zorian, in all honesty. "Well, that wasn't entirely true." "All right," said Zorian, rising from his seat. "I guess we are doing this, then. However, I think a slight modification is in order." "Slight, huh?" Zack said with a grin. "If we are going to get the maximum amount of time out of the modified black room, the extra manpower is not enough," said Zorian. "We need a dimensionalism image of the highest caliber if we are going to get truly spectacular results." "So? Those don't exactly grow on trees," Zack pointed out, throwing the pen back at him. "Where are we going to find one of those?" Zorian caught the pen flying at him with practiced ease. "How attached are you to that crown we took from Quatachichel?" Zorian asked Zack with a knowing smile. Zack's expression immediately fell. "Oh, you can't be serious," Zack complained. "Oh, but he was. He really was." "Come on," Zorian told him, motioning him to get up from the floor. "Let's go talk to our favorite lich." Break. Somewhere in Eldamar, a field was burning. Two masked teenagers were engaged in a vicious fight against an ancient Ebesan lich, and the landscape around them was devastated in their passing. Once this had been a wheat field in full bloom, but it was now just an ashen land covered in craters. Broken remains of undead servants and golems littered the ground, and strange rock formations rose out of the ground in places where the two sides tried to entomb each other in solid stone. Somewhere out there, Zorian mused, a farmer was going to be very devastated when he saw what had happened to his harvest. This was the third time he and Zack had clashed with the lich like this in the last few days. However, this was fine as far as Zorian was concerned. He considered this to be simply a part of their negotiation with Quatachichel, rather than as a waste of time. They were proving to the lich that they were legitimate threats and that he should take them seriously. Earlier, when they had taken the crown from him in this restart, they had done it through an ambush and by employing something that could be dismissed as a mere trick. Through these fights, they were showing Quatachichel there was more to them than that. Quatachichel had never stopped looking for them all this time, of course. He had no idea it was Zack and Zorian who had stolen his crown, since they had worn disguises when they had ambushed him and covered their tracks extremely well, but he had somehow managed to find out about the existence of their group in general. He seemed to have identified Xvim, Alanik, Ilsa and Chiron as the leaders of the group, possibly because they interacted with the authorities relatively often. He had tried to target them by ransacking their homes and such, but this hadn't been very effective. All temporary loopers had vacated their usual homes by now, and were not that easy to catch. Plus, he couldn't be too brazen about wrecking things or he would put his own invasion plans into danger. This sort of situation must have been rather frustrating for the ancient lich, because he had attacked them immediately when they had shown up in front of him again. He hadn't even given them a chance to speak. Rude. A giant, scintillating ball of red light screamed through the air towards Zorian. He thrust his hand at it, causing a conical wave of barely visible rainbow light to wash over it. It unraveled instantly, revealing a dimmer, but much more dangerous arrow of green energies hurtling at his chest. The simulacrum standing beside him immediately thrust his arm into the path of the arrow, sacrificing it to shield Zorian from the blow. The arm exploded at the mere touch of the magical projectile, negating the attack but showering Zorian with a rain of metal shrapnel. Zorian didn't try to defend himself against the flying metal pieces, opting to keep casting his counterattack instead. The shrapnel was stopped by his shield, a faint honeycomb pattern momentarily becoming visible around him as it absorbed the attack, and then Zorian finished his spell. Nothing visibly happened, but this was because his projectiles were utterly invisible. A pair of circular discs of severing force made their way towards the Lich, who was currently busy dodging massive boulders and fireballs that Zack was sending his way. Beside them, Princess released a loud roar into the air with 6 of her many heads, the last 2 being busy chewing through the throat of a giant eagle she managed to snatch straight out of the air. The great bird hung limply from her jaws, its riders nowhere to be seen. The fight had been going on for long enough that an Eldemarian response group had reached them and tried to involve themselves into the fight. Unfortunately for them, neither group had appreciated their interference. Their eagle riders had lost at least half of their numbers. One could see the charred husks of their eagles and mages mixed among the wreckage of the battlefield if one looked closely enough. The remaining eagles now circled uneasily in the sky above, keeping their distance and simply observing things. Several sites in the distance were also smoking. These were the places where Eldemarian forces had tried to set up artillery positions to pick them off from a distance. Quatachichul hadn't liked that idea, though, and after he had finished wiping them all out, they did not bother trying a second attempt at it. Zack shouted an order at Princess, and she roughly threw the dead eagle aside and disappeared. Well, teleported to be more exact. She reappeared instantly at Quatachichul's side, where she instantly tried biting and trampling him. Even the ancient Lich had trouble putting down such a large, regenerating beast. Especially when Zack and Zorian were there keeping him from being able to focus solely on dealing with her. Distracted as he was by the Hydra and Zack, Quatachichul did not notice the severing discs until it was too late and ended up losing one of his arms. This, in turn, placed him at an even bigger disadvantage and forced him to burn through a lot of his mana reserves to fend them off and stabilize himself. Now that he had no Imperial crown on him, his mana reserves were no longer quite as ridiculous as they once were. He could no longer just outlast them by default. Now Zack proudly wore the crown to battle, which meant it was Quatachichul who had to worry about a war of attrition. The battle continued on for another 5 minutes before eventually slowing down. Eventually, the two sides found themselves staring at each other over an expanse of barren land, waiting for the other to make a move. Zack and Zorian could press their advantage, of course, but that would only cause the Lich to flee. There was no point to that, really. The seconds slowly ticked by with nothing to show for it. The only sounds were occasional screeching of giant eagles circling overhead and Princess hissing at them and at Quatachichul in response. "Hey," Zack finally said, his voice magically distorted and his face hidden behind a blank white mask. He pulled the Imperial crown off his head and twirled it around his finger playfully. "Are you looking for this?" Quatachichul's response was to fire one of his signature red disintegration beams at him. However, Zack did not move a finger to dodge or block it. The beam just curved unnaturally around him and missed. "We might be willing to give it back," Zorian pointed out, his voice also distorted. Quatachichul cocked his head to the side curiously, saying nothing. "Or we can just continue this for another couple of days, I guess," Zack added. "I don't know about you, but I kind of enjoy these clashes between us. A bit of excitement to spice up the day, you know? So, you want to talk, huh?" Quatachichul observed. He looked up at the Eldamar eagle riders circling above. "This probably isn't the best place to do it, though." "Pick a time and place, then," Zack said. "Just don't keep us waiting for too long. We're on a bit of a time limit here. You drag your feet too much and we'll just keep the crown and be done with it." Quatachichul didn't bother answering him. He simply picked up a rock from the ground and squeezed it in his skeletal hand. Bright orange lines burned themselves into the surface of the rock before fading away. The Lich then threw the rock at their feet and then teleported away. Zorian picked the rock up. It was still warm, and there was a time and address carved into it, plus a single sentence at the end. Don't be late. Break. Zorian had no intention of telling Quetzalcoatl about the time loop or trying to talk him into helping them get out. That would obviously just blow up in their faces. The ancient lich had no motivation to sabotage the plans of his original self by helping them escape into the real world. The last time he had realized he was just a copy in a duplicate world, he had had no compunctions whatsoever about sacrificing himself to advance the cause of his original by crippling them. A person like that wouldn't help them just to save his own hide, and they had nothing to really offer him. But they did not have to tell him about the time loop. They did not have to ask him to help them to escape. What they needed at the moment was more time, and to get that they needed their Black Room project to succeed. And with Quetzalcoatl's help, it could very well succeed spectacularly. At the moment, they were in a private room in one of Sioria's many restaurants, discussing this idea with the Ebeson leader. Quetzalcoatl was in his human disguise, and Zack and Zorian had agreed to come unmasked as a show of trust. So let me get this straight, Quetzalcoatl said, playing around with his glass. You want me to help you improve Eldamar's time dilation room to a completely ridiculous rate of dilation. Specifically, we need another 5 months, Zack said, cutting into his speech. And in exchange you are going to give me my own crown back? Finished Quetzalcoatl, pretending he didn't hear him. Doesn't that strike you as incredibly brazen and a foolish thing to ask for? I mean, I will get that crown back. It's just a matter of time. See, that's where you're wrong, said Zack. Zorian, do your thing. Zorian nodded and started casting the gate spell. Quetzalcoatl was instantly on guard, but he only tensed imperceptibly and did not attack them or voice any protest. He watched curiously as Zorian finished casting the spell and opened a miniature dimensional gate just above his palm. If one looked closely, they could see a featureless patch of water by looking through the gate. Well, done? Quetzalcoatl said dubiously. You can cast the gate spell. Not something many people can brag about, but scan it, Zack told him. See where it leads. Frowning, Quetzalcoatl did just that, casting a bunch of divinations to determine the location of the other side of the portal. After a full 2 minutes of tinkering, he leaned back in his chair and gave Zack a strange look. It's just a random patch of the ocean, as far as I can see. Very far away from any land, he said. Precisely, Zack said, grinning from ear to ear. Now, what do you think would happen if we just chucked this crown through that portal and closed it? Quetzalcoatl's eyes widened in shock and realization. The truth was that the deep sea was utterly unreachable from the perspective of humanity. Even the most powerful of mages would have no hopes of finding something that had been thrown away into the middle of the ocean. Even a lich like Quetzalcoatl, who had no need to breathe and potentially live forever, would balk at the idea of searching through the ocean floor for a needle in a haystack. If Zack and Zorian really did pick a random spot in the ocean, far away from any land, and threw the crown there, it would be scarcely different from destroying it utterly. You wouldn't, Quetzalcoatl said severely. The value of that crown, if we can't get this black room to work, we're dead, Zack said, leaning forward towards the lich. There, I said it. We're desperate and our lives literally depend on this working. So if we fail, this crown is utterly useless to us. Why keep it around, then? Anyone we give it to would just become a target for you. Better to throw it into the sea so you can't have it. You, said Quetzalcoatl, speechless for a moment. He shook his head. I see. So I either get the crown back from you now or I lose it forever. Is that what you're saying? That is what we're saying, Zack said, leaning back into his chair with a bright smile. Besides, Don't pretend you aren't interested in the black rooms and that helping us with this is just a chore for you, Zorian pointed out. We know for a fact that you have been interested in the time magic research facility beneath Seoria for quite some time. Black room projects require a great deal of funding and manpower to be developed, and Alquanabasa is probably not very abundant in either. This is a bit unfortunate since, as a place full of undead, you are the nation most able to exploit this sort of thing to its full potential. No need to worry about lifespan limits if you don't age. And you definitely need every advantage you can get, if you were to really compete with Aldemar and other Altasian powers. Am I right? Maybe, said Quatachichil after a short pause. You're saying I would get all the information regarding the Aldemarian Black Room project? How else can we expect you to help us improve it? Zorian asked. However, you're thinking too small. It's not just the Aldemarian project that you would have access to. It's also the Salamnon project, and the Falkrinian projects, and everyone's project. Every Black Room project on the continent. He took out a bright red folder out of his bag and handed it to Quatachichil. It did not hold any comprehensive notes, of course, but it held enough to make it clear what kind of information Zack and Zorian had at their disposal. Quatachichil leafed through the folder, slowly at first but picking up as he saw more and more. His eyebrows also got higher and higher as he got closer to the end. This. How did you even get this? He asked them. He sounded honestly impressed. We raided every Black Room facility on the continent and stole their notes and research data, Zorian said. Quatachichil hummed lightly. I guess this really is very important to you. They spent the next 15 minutes discussing the details of the proposed agreement. Though Quatachichil never really agreed to anything and did his best to look uninterested, Zorian could tell they were gradually winning him over. So, there is one thing I'm really concerned about here, the ancient lich finally said. If I agree to this and help you as we agreed, what motive do you have to honor your part of the deal in the end? Yes, I will admit a certain amount of interest in the information you have about black rooms, but the crown you stole from me is the real issue. What guarantee do I have that you'll actually hand it over to me at the end? If you agree to help us, we will hand you the crown right now, Zorian said. Quatachichil raised his eyebrow at them. He had been doing that a lot in this conversation. Yes, really, Zorian confirmed. Zack had already used the key to unbar the gate. Now the only value of the Imperial items was in their basic abilities, and while the crown was extremely useful, they needed Quatachichil's help far more at the moment. They could always steal the crown the original was wearing when they got to the real world. What makes you think I won't just take the crown and walk away laughing? Quatachichil asked curiously. You could do that, yes, Zack said. We don't think you will, though. You're an honorable kind of undead. Huh? I don't know whether to feel pleased my reputation is so good or look down on you for being so foolish, the lich said. Does that mean you agree to the deal? Zack asked him. Let me ask you a question, the Ebeson leader said. What actually made you think you could work with me on this? I mean, yes, you clearly looked into me for quite some time before making your move. You even did that without me becoming aware that someone was plotting against me, and some part of me cannot help but be impressed by that. However, it still seems very strange you feel confident enough to propose this deal. Seems very risky. We live a very risky life, Zack said, grinning. Yet you're still alive, the lich noted with a more subdued smile of his own. Clearly it is not just a matter of overconfidence, then. If we answer this question for you, will you answer one of ours? Zorian asked him. Sure, Quatachichil said, waving his hand in front of him carelessly. Ask away. Why are you working with the cult of the World Dragon to release the primordial trapped in Seoria? Zorian asked. I refuse to believe someone like you would be ignorant of what exactly you were tangling with. This is not some fancy summon that will go away in a few hours, nor is it just a powerful monster. This is a creature that even the gods had trouble killing. Why would you set that thing loose on the world? I can see a regular rogue mage not caring about the consequences much, but surely you do. You have a homeland you care deeply for, and you probably intend to be alive for a very long time from now. Forever, Kotachichil said. I intend to live forever. Then why? Zorian asked. Why release a godlike entity that could very well destroy everything in a few centuries? The Lich looked at him for a few seconds, looking amused. Ha ha. The Lich laughed. So, you do know about the whole invasion business I'm a part of? Yes, Zack confirmed. We do. As I expected, Kotachichil responded. I guess that kind of answers my question, doesn't it? If you know about the invasion plot, you already know I'm willing to enter into highly risky and insane deals if the benefits are big enough. But anyway, about your question. The thing is, I don't think the Primordial is going to be allowed to run free that long. Never mind centuries, I don't think it is going to last 2 weeks. Why? Zack asked, frowning. Because I have faith in the angels, the Lich said. What? Sounds strange to have someone like me say that, doesn't it? Kotachichil said, smiling knowingly. It's true, though. The gods may be gone, but the angels are still around, and I have no doubt they would do everything in their power to either reseal or kill the Primordial. Their restrictions limit their ability to meddle in the physical world, so it's easy to underestimate them. But they have some truly awe-inspiring beings and weapons on their side. I should know. I saw them personally fighting a few times. One Primordial should not be impossible for them to handle. So you want to free the Primordial, knowing the angels would take care of it long before it becomes your problem. Zorian said. Yes, the Lich confirmed. Frankly, my main worry is not that the angels will not be able to handle it. My main worry is that they will take care of it too quickly and that the damage from its release and subsequent rampage will be too limited in scope. I ordered all the temples razed to the ground at the very beginning of the invasion, but I fear it may not be enough. The angels can be surprisingly subtle and underhanded when they want to be. For all I know, they may be working against me even now. He had no idea. We are actually really fortunate, Kotachichil continued, sounding very smug. It is likely that the ability of the angels to interfere with our plans is even more limited due to the recent complications in the spiritual spheres. You mean the fact all communications with the spiritual world have been severed lately? Zorian asked. Very well informed, indeed, Kotachichil mumbled quietly. Yes, that. It's rather unplanned, but not unwelcome. You could say the very heavens are helping me, ha ha. A small silence descended on the scene. So, Zack said. Do we have a deal or not? I suppose we do, the Lich said. I must be going senile in my old age, but I'll give you a chance. Oh yeah, one more thing, Zorian said. We kind of also approached the esoteric order of the Celestial Dragon about this and some other things. Unfortunately, they have been more unreasonable about this than you have, so we have kind of ended up kidnapping them. He threw a small painting on the table. It was very realistic, depicting a group of bound and gagged men. There was no proof that the picture was real, of course, but Kotachichil frowned when he saw it and stayed silent. Since we're working together now, we were hoping you could help us convince them to cooperate, Zorian said. At the very least, we need their help to make this deal between us actually work. Otherwise, I fear we'll be forced to subject them to our intense cooperation techniques. HMPH. Of course the incompetent idiots got captured, Quetzalcoatl muttered. He threw the picture onto the table before giving them a more cautious, speculative look. He then thrust his hand towards them, palm pointing upwards. "The crown," he demanded, shaking his hand. With a sigh, Zack reached towards one of his pockets and pulled out the imperial crown. He gave it a look of sad longing before slowly and carefully placing it in Quetzalcoatl's palm. The Lich immediately placed the crown on the top of his head, a web of geometric lines immediately lighting up all over his skin and flashing dangerously. For a moment his disguise dropped and his black skeletal form became plainly visible, but then he was back to normal and his human guise was intact. The crown was no longer visible, hidden under whatever magic Quetzalcoatl used to keep himself looking like a living being. "Right," he said. "Take me to those clowns and I'll talk to them. They'll cooperate." Break. Things developed very quickly after that. Zorian was honestly surprised how well things turned out. He was afraid the kidnapped mages would refuse to work or drag their feet whenever possible. He was afraid Quetzalcoatl would just take the crown and just leave them to their devices while laughing at their stupidity. He was afraid the cult leaders would sabotage everything out of spite, resentful that they had been basically arm-twisted into agreeing with their plans. None of these things happened. The kidnapped researchers mostly chose to work with them instead of being defiant. A surprising number of them were even enthusiastic about the project, once they realized what they had been recruited to work on. It probably helped that Zack and Zorian promised them they could take all the documentation related to the project back home with them when they were finished. Though somewhat skeptical about that, the sheer scale of the project seemed to put people at ease. There was no way they would kill so many people just to shut everyone up, right? Quetzalcoatl was a skeleton of his word. Just like he had never tried to cheat them after agreeing to teach them his magical skills, he did not attempt to get out of helping with the project once he committed to it. Which was great, because his help was insanely helpful and they would never have gotten as far as they did without him. He was more than just a replacement for Silver Lake, he was vastly better than her, and Zorian was honestly kind of sorry they couldn't recruit him to work on the TimeLoop exit project as well. With his help, their odds would have improved immensely. Alas, the idea of informing him about the TimeLoop was still as foolish as it always had been. Even if Red Robe had left the TimeLoop thanks to a deal with Panaxleth, he still had to find a way to make his temporary marker last past the 6-month time limit, Zorian told Zack when they were discussing the topic at one point. "You think it wasn't Panaxleth who helped him modify that?" Zack asked. "Maybe it did, but I doubt the Primordial actually did any modification itself. It may have given Red Robe clues and instructions, but he still needed to find someone to do that for him." "And you think that someone was Quetzalcoatl?" Zack guessed. "Yes," Zorian confirmed. "Yet, if Quetzalcoatl helped Red Robe acquire a permanent marker, why would he not acquire one himself?" "Perhaps he couldn't," offered Zack. "I mean, the fact that temporary markers do not work on people for 6 restarts after the previous temporary marker runs out clearly indicates it's not the marker that does the counting. It's the Sovereign Gate and the Guardian of the Threshold." "So?" Zorian asked. "So that means modifying a temporary marker has to be done before the Sovereign Gate processes it in some way. In all likelihood, that means any change to them must be made before the restart in which they gained the marker ends. We know from your example that the Guardian can only do certain things at the end of the restart, and this is probably one of them. This would also explain why we never managed to figure out a way to modify them that worked. The moment that first restart ended, the chance was lost, and we never even realized it." "Ah," Zorian said. "That did make a lot of sense. So you think Quetzalcoatl was already a temporary looper for a while before Red Robe entered?" "I don't know. I'm just throwing the idea out there, I guess. Zack said with a shrug. What do you think happened? I think maybe Quetzalcoatl didn't even want to leave the time loop, even if he found out about it, Zorian said. I mean, definitely not through a method Red Robe and Silver Lake used. Entering into a death pact with a primordial? Not a chance. And physically leaving on your own is very hard. I don't think even Quetzalcoatl could have pulled it off, considering the amount of effort we had to put into it. Perhaps he simply made a deal with Red Robe, similar to what I have with Xvim, Kill and the others. Once he gets out, he gives Quetzalcoatl a mountain of notes and other information, and in exchange he helps modify Red Robe's marker. He could have still demanded a temporary marker of his own and modified that, Zack pointed out. Just in case, you know. Yeah, I guess, Zorian said after a while. I don't know. Maybe it's as you say, and he just couldn't. I could see Panaxith giving Red Robe a very specific solution tailored for him alone. It probably doesn't want anyone getting out without making a deal with him. Their interaction with the cult of the World Dragon was very adversarial at first. For one thing, they had kidnapped them and blackmailed them into working with them, so it was inevitable they were not too enthusiastic about cooperating. It also didn't help that Zorian evacuated all the shifters out of the city and informed the cult leadership that no child sacrifice would be allowed in their attempt to free Panaxith from his prison. That led to a lot of shouting and even a brief exchange of combat spells. However, the cult leaders would ultimately see the light when Zack and Zorian showed them the Sovereign Gate. They did not explain to the cultists what the object exactly did, but they did tell them it was a divine artifact that contained some of the essence of Panaxith itself, and could thus be used as a key to open Panaxith's prison. A much better key than the shifter blood essence they originally planned to use for the purpose, too. Though their description was deceptive, the basic facts were entirely true. Within the reality of the time loop, the Sovereign Gate could very much be used as a key to open Panaxith's prison. In fact, using the Sovereign Gate was the key part of their plan to exit the time loop. This had been true while they had Silver Lake's cooperation, and it was true now. Zorian had been a little worried that the cultists would figure out too much if given access to the Sovereign Gate, but thankfully that never happened. They were overjoyed with it, but only because it was a better, fancier key to releasing Panaxith out of its prison. They never realized what was truly going on inside of it. Considering it was a divine artifact, and that those were notoriously hard to figure out, Zorian probably shouldn't have been surprised at that. In any case, their plans went off flawlessly. Better than they could have hoped, even. They had dug up a massive underground facility, reshaped the entire local geomantic web to fuel its creation, and then surrounded the Imperial Orb with layers upon layers of complicated wards and barriers made out of extremely expensive materials. The cost of the whole project was enough to bankrupt a small country and would give even a major nation like Eldaemar and Falkrania pause if they had to pay for it. By the end of it, even Quetzalcoatl seemed to be getting a little uneasy at the amount of resources and effort being put into this thing. It didn't matter though, because he stayed true to his word and the project was finished on time. 6 days before the end of the restart, the improved Black Room was done. A large throng of people, time loopers, cult leaders and the more enthusiastic of the kidnapped researchers, piled on into the Imperial Orb, and then the time dilation was activated. They would spend the next 5 months inside the Imperial Orb. Outside, a single day would pass. Quetzalcoatl did not join them in the Orb, despite helping them make it. This was smart of him, because Zack and Zorian would have killed him the moment the Orb was isolated from the outside world and stolen his crown again. Zorian wasn't sure whether Quetzalcoatl could have escaped back to his phylactery if he was killed inside the palace orb, but even if he could they wouldn't care. The important thing was that he could not escape when overpowered inside the orb, and that having him inside for the full 5 months was too much of a risk. The cult leaders were manageable. Someone like Kotachichel wasn't. In any case, the next 5 months would consist of improving everyone's skills so they could help with the final exit plan, manufacturing the necessary ward stones and blueprints to prepare the terrain, and so on. It would be a bit of a challenge to hide the true meaning of all the preparations from the cult leaders and the like, but Zorian was not opposed to simply killing them if they ended up revealing too much to them, so whatever. Zorian had another thing he wanted to do, though. Something he wanted to keep hidden from most people, including Zack. Thus, he gathered most of the Ernia loopers, plus Xvim and Damon, and brought them to one of the isolated corners of the orb dimension for a talk. "What a strange group you have gathered," Xvim remarked. "It seems you are still not satisfied with your mind magic skills, if I am reading the situation correctly." "Seriously?" Damon complained. "Aren't you good enough at that, already?" "You can never get good enough at mind magic," one of the Ernia responded. "Indeed," Zorian said. "It's my best skill, and it's good to keep working on those. However, I didn't bring you here to work on my general mind magic skills. What I want is to figure out a way to get past the mind blank spell and target a person with mind magic anyway." A look of realization entered everyone's eyes. Even the Ernia. Their body language was a little hard to read, but Zorian had gotten a feeling for it by now. Then they all got to work. Break. The escape attempted to happen at the end of the month, on the day of the summer festival. The reasoning for this was identical to the one the Ibisons and the cultists used to launch their invasion at that particular moment in time. This was the peak of the planetary alignment, when dimensionalism magic was at its strongest. When the group left the Imperial Orb, only 5 days remained until the deadline. This was not much, but it was enough to make the necessary preparations. The time magic research facility was completely repurposed into a part of the exit ritual. Large sections of the whole were covered in carved spell formula and embedded with strange metallic ward stones. The cultists they had spent 5 months training in dimensionalism and divinations had analyzed Panaxith's prison and shared their results with the group. They seemed honestly grateful to Zack and Zorian for the help they had given them, which made Zorian feel just a little bit guilty about intending to utterly betray them in the end. Not enough for him to do anything differently, but still. Sadly, the final plan they had agreed upon had some unfortunate details. The original plan was to use Panaxith's prison as a bridge, opening a dimensional gate that would connect a spot in the time loop with the same spot in the real world. That plan was now largely unworkable. Silver Lake had been the only one who knew how to interact with the Primordial's prison with sufficient finesse to make that possible. Despite their best efforts in trying to develop that skill in some of their people, they had failed to duplicate her feats. It did not help that they obviously could not experiment on the primordial prison itself while inside the Imperial Orb. They could only work on their general dimensionalism skills and try to guess what was necessary to interact with it properly. Still, while the original plan was no longer possible, they did have an alternative. It was just that this plan required them to crack open Panaxith's prison and then sacrifice the Imperial Orb to serve as a bridge they needed to connect the two realities. There were two problems with this. The first was that it required them to destabilize the Primordial's prison and make a crack in it, something that usually triggered the premature end to the restart and would allow Panaxith to extend its influence outside the prison while they attempted to form the bridge. This would be solved by enclosing the area with multiple layers of dimensional membranes, so that even after breaching its prison, Panaxith would not be truly free. They weren't totally sure it would work, but it was the best idea they had and the theory was sound. Even if it worked, though, it would only stop the restart from ending immediately, It would do nothing to stop Panaxeth from rampaging about. The other was that using the Imperial Orb that way meant they couldn't take it with them to the real world. It would have to stay behind to form a path for them, which would sharply limit the amount of things they could bring with them from the time loop, as well as result in the total loss of all of the research notes and blueprints Zorian had stored in its memory bank. That was painful, to say the least. There was no other choice, however. The Imperial Orb was the only pocket dimension reinforced with divine power that they knew of. It was the only thing they knew of that could withstand the dimensional stresses involved in the procedure. Everything else would break in seconds. Deciding what to bring with them and what to leave behind was stressful and led to a lot of arguments, but somehow they managed to cut their possessions down to a manageable level. Days passed in a flash, until there was no more time. The summer festival was upon them, and the invasion was about to begin. Zack and Zorian had meant to kill all the cult leaders the day before, to make sure they wouldn't interfere with their work, but their unlikely allies surprised them by graciously agreeing to step aside of their own free will. The official reason was that they had figured out that their group planned to release the Primordial too, and that thus there was no need for them to get involved. Zorian did not believe that for a second, of course. The leadership of the cult wanted to control the Primordial, not just release it. Moreover, Kotachichul was never very far from the cult leaders these days, making direct moves against them impossible. Reluctantly, they decided to let the matter drop. Hopefully the Lich and the cultists would be too busy fighting the city to try and sabotage their operation. They had done their best to covertly prepare the city and its defenders for the upcoming invasion, so the attackers should have their hands full in that regard. They simply made the last round of preparations and then settled down to wait. Everything was ready. Zorian turned to Zack. "If this fails, I'm dead," he told him. Zack shifted uncomfortably. "The Guardian may have been lying for some reason," he said. "Perhaps you will wake up at the start of the next restart and, maybe," said Zorian, cutting him off. He really doubted it, though. However, it's best to plan for things not being so convenient. Anyway, if everything fails and we all die, it's all up to you. You're our last and only hope. I guess," Zack sighed, looking really pained at the idea of him getting out of this thing alone. "Look, I know this probably sounds hollow. But if anything happens to you, I promise I will take care of your original self, all right?" "That actually does make me feel somewhat better," Zorian said. "Come on. It's starting." The ritual was taking place inside the hole, on a floating platform. There was a raised dais in the center, on which the Sovereign Gate stood. It struck Zorian that this was a very similar setup to the one the cult had used for their ritual. They really had ended up supplanting their role in a way, hadn't they? Of course, the real setup their group was using was much more extensive than what the cultists had used in the past. Though the main ritual grounds consisted of this one floating platform, the supporting mechanisms actually extended throughout the entire local underworld. Additionally, the entire space around them was enclosed in several layers of dimensional membranes that isolated the place from the outside world as much as possible. There would be no plucky trio of mages simply flying up to them in a sphere of white force to disrupt the whole thing from within, like Zack and Zorian had done to the cultists in one of the previous restarts. The entire group arranged itself into a series of 3 concentric circles. Zack, Zorian, Daemon and Xveen were at the very center, surrounding the Sovereign Gate. They were the people most skilled in dimensionalism, and thus the most crucial for the effort. Around them were dozens of people who had enough skills to contribute, but not enough to take on a heavy burden that the main 4 were responsible for. Finally, there was the rest of the group who couldn't really help the procedure work, and could only stay back and pray for everyone's success. They were here only because once the area had been enclosed in dimensional membranes, no one could get in without disrupting everything and causing the ritual to fail. Thus, if they wanted to get them outside, they had to be present inside while the ritual took place. After some shouting and pushing, everyone was in their assigned position and, hopefully, knew what to do. They started casting. For the first 5 minutes, nothing much happened. The air above the platform warped and twisted like hot summer air, but nothing more than that occurred. The group had to be exceptionally careful about their spell work and timing, and it meant work was bound to be slow. Still, everything was proceeding well so the walls of the hole shook, sending dust and pebbles everywhere and causing the inscribed spell formula in the walls to flare and flicker with an ominous blue light. A deep rumbling sound emanated from somewhere in the distance, like a growl of a titanic beast. Crap. What the hell was going on outside? What were Quatachichel and the cultists doing? Stay focused. Xvim warned. We are at a critical. Another tremor, this one even stronger, shook the entire place, and everything suddenly went to hell. The shimmering, controlled breach they were working towards quickly spun out of control, and a pitch-black, irregular crack suddenly manifested itself in the air around them. Shit. Zack swore. Suppress it. Suppress it. But it was too late. A swarm of dark brown tentacles, replicant covered in thorns, rushed out of the crack and sent everyone scattering out of their positions. The crack widened, revealing a giant, three-lobed, inhuman eye lurking behind the dimensional barrier, and more tentacles rushed out to confront them. These were thicker, and had rather human-like hands attached at the end. Though things had gone badly, all was not lost. They had made the ritual with certain tolerances, and this was still a manageable outcome. Quickly, many of the people standing around in the third circle of the ritual rushed forwards and started fighting the tentacles. People like Chiron and Tivin had no skills with which to help the ritual itself, but they had plenty of combat power and no other duties to distract them. They fearlessly charged into the invading primordial mass, recklessly burning through their mana to keep it away from Zorian and the others. As for Zack and Zorian, they were busy suppressing the breach and could offer very little help. Should their attention lapse for even a second, Panaxith would overwhelm them before they could blink. They frantically dodged the flailing tentacles, shaping and stabilizing the breach into something manageable. Dimly, Zorian was aware that one of the hands that got severed in half by Taven suddenly grew legs and claws and flung itself at her. Taven ended up tackled at the ground, unable to cast much of anything. Chiron managed to blast the thing off of her, but she had to be dragged off to the side, effectively out of the fight. She was also bleeding heavily, leaving a thick trail of blood as she was dragged to the edge of the platform. Zorian had no idea if she was going to live, and couldn't really afford to check at the moment. Not far from there, one of the Arania tried to block one of the thin, thorny tentacles with a force shield but found her defenses to be lacking. The tentacle punched through her shield and swiftly wrapped itself around her torso several times. That's when they found out that the thorns weren't just very sharp, but were also thin and bladed like a razor. The high-pitched scream of the Arania cut off quickly as the thorns effortlessly sliced through her exoskeleton and turned her into a mutilated corpse. The tentacle then picked up the corpse and started waving it around like a bloody flail, sending blood and viscera everywhere. Some of the mages panicked or flinched when the Iranian blood splattered all over them, even if no actual damage was done, and their efforts to keep the breach in check started to fail. "Damn it," swore Zorian, reaching into his jacket pocket and removing a handful of steel spheres densely covered in spell formula. He had been hoping to save these for later. He needed them later. But if he didn't use this now, they were done for. He flung the spheres at the rift above and they spontaneously aligned themselves around it into a quickly rotating ring before starting to glow. The primordial's tentacles reacted quickly, switching directions and trying to tear the sphere formation apart, but thankfully the rest of the group immediately realized they could not let that happen. A swarm of multicolored rays, bullets, and more exotic projectiles intercepted the tentacles, halting their charge for a moment. A moment was enough. The spheres erupted into blinding white light, blinding everyone for a moment, and then the rift abruptly shrunk. Some of the tentacles, cut off from the source of their mass by the shrinkage, fell from the sky, crashing onto the platform with a loud thud. Their relief was short-lived, however, since the tentacles soon started twitching and bubbling like boiling water, before starting to merge into an ovoid, chrysalis-like mass. Atlantic was the first to act, sending streams of white-hot flames at the forming cocoon, and then everyone joined in. However, the structure seemed to have developed some kind of resistance to the spells they had used on the tentacles thus far, because it was stubbornly resisting attempts to eradicate it. Deep within it, some horrible shape rapidly began to form. And the sovereign gate spontaneously started glowing white, a silhouette of the familiar form of the guardian of the threshold forming right above it. "Shit." Zorian couldn't help but mumble. "Use the orb," Xvim said. But Damon protested. "We have no choice," Xvim interrupted. "We have no time. It has to be now." After a moment of indecision, Damon reached to his side and threw the Imperial Orb at the crack. Zack, Damon, Zorian and Xvim quickly started casting layers upon layers of spells on it, trying to integrate it into Panaxith's prison like they had intended. It wasn't going well enough, so Zorian reached for more of the items he prepared for this, a collection of metal tablets, several staves made out of alchemically treated wood, and a box of several hundred marbles, each of which contained a three-dimensional spell formula made out of metal wire. He sacrificed it all in succession and even burned some of his life force to make his spells hit harder. He was fairly sure he noticed Zack, Xvim and Damon doing the same, burning their life to make sure the fusion worked. They succeeded. The Imperial Orb pulsed 3 times with translucent waves of rainbow light before pulling the pitch-black rift into itself. The crack in the sky disappeared, but the orb seemed to pull in the space around it still. The air warped and rippled, forming a pitch-black sphere above the orb, its surface rippling like water. Around it, a smoky gray torus burst into existence, crackling with multicolored energies. Then another, and then another, until 3 gray tori revolved around the pitch-black sphere that had suddenly grown perfectly still and featureless. The exit. It was ready. Unfortunately, that's when the glowing form of the guardian of the threshold finished materializing. It did not speak a word, simply raising its hand at the group and releasing a thick, blinding beam of white energy at them. The beam did not even cross half of the distance towards them before it suddenly split into more than 100 thinner, but equally bright beams. Zack and Zorian's simulacrums, previously held in reserve, sprang into action. So did the combat golems Zorian made for the occasion. But the beams were fast and each one swerved and pivoted in the air like a living thing, tracking its chosen target. Hastily erected defenses did nothing to stop them, and Zorian was pained to see Ilsa, Nora, and 2 of the Arania killed on the spot when the beams hit them. The exit was right there, open and ready, yet 4 people had died so close to their salvation. Some people fired a counterattack at the spectral form of the Guardian, but the entity did not attempt to dodge or shield itself from the attacks in any way. Every attack that reached it simply sank into its glowing form and disappeared. There was no indication that the Guardian had suffered any damage from the attacks, or even that it had noticed them. Damn it, they needed to start the evacuation now. Zorian started directing his simulacrums to start the preparations, but that's when the primordial chrysalis from before suddenly exploded, a large, vaguely humanoid beast bursting out of it. It had 4 arms. A 3-eyed, skeletal head stood attached to its shoulders through a long,
flexible neck. Its tail was extremely long and thin, and ended with a hand-like appendage. Glossy, chitinous carapace covered it, studded with thin, razor-like spikes. It roared horribly, its sound incredibly loud and grating. And then it dropped on all 6 of its main limbs and charged straight at the center of the platform, where Zorian and the others were located. Anyone who tried to get in its way was flung aside like a rag doll, and every spell that hit it was resisted with little to show for it. The glowing form of the Guardian raised its hand again, another beam sparkling on its fingers. And then, to add a final insult to it all, the entire area rocked and shook as a series of loud booms erupted from somewhere above. Zorian's heart sank. There was no mistaking it. Someone was attacking their ritual grounds from the outside. Probably Quatachichel and the cultists. Damn it. How did they? No, that was a silly thing to ask. He had to focus on the now. He hit two. The Guardian fired another white beam of death. It once again flowered into hundreds of smaller beams, and this time they were not capable of minimizing the effects. Zorian joined his simulacrums in blocking as many as he could, but it was not enough. He watched, horrified, as Kale tried to shield his little daughter from one of the beams with his body. The beam drilled straight through them, killing them both on the spot. Chiron managed to block the beam, but that made him too distracted to deal with the primordial beast running up to him from behind. Its massive, clawed hand swiped across him, shattering through his hastily erected shield and cleaving him in half before continuing its relentless advance. Another series of explosions sounded from just outside the ritual grounds, and the spell formula that stabilized the exit to the time loop flickered dangerously. A small, almost imperceptible crack appeared on the Imperial orb floating just beneath the exit. It could no longer handle the strain of maintaining the bridge to the real world. Somewhere on the edge of the platform, Zorian could feel Taven's soul suddenly wink out. She probably bled to death while everyone was too busy fighting for their life to tend to her wounds. Suddenly, it dawned to Zorian that they were all going to die here. They were so close, they had practically won, and yet. Truthfully, I think I'd always known it would end this way, Damon suddenly said with a small sigh. He took a knife out of his pocket and ruthlessly slashed at his wrists. Damon. What are you doing? Zorian screeched at him. You have to live, Damon told him, his hands trembling as he went through a complicated series of gestures with them, his wrists heavily dripping blood. It's fine if I die, but you have to live. Don't let it all be in vain. It can't. Suddenly, he thrust his bloody hands towards the collapsing exit in the air, pouring every shred of his life force into the stabilization wards. The cracks on the Imperial orb stopped spreading, the black surface of the exit calmed down into its smooth, peaceful state, and the spell formula lining the walls stopped fluctuating for the moment. Xvim watched the scene for a moment before focusing on Zorian. Go, he said. Zack and I will keep the exit stable while you pass through. Zack doesn't need this, but you, Zorian protested. Go. Xvim shouted at him. Zack cannot keep this stable by himself. Go now. He could do that, yes. He could go through by himself, abandoning everyone to their fate. But that. He glanced at the others, desperately fighting to keep the primordial beast away from them and keeping the Guardian of the Threshold busy with other targets. They knew the exit was there. They could have just dropped everything and made a mad dash at the exit in hopes that some of them would make it. Wouldn't that be the smartest choice, individually? Yet none of them had made that choice. Steeling his heart, Zorian stopped focusing on the maintenance of the exit, handing over his part of the burden to Xvim and Zack, who visibly struggled under the increased strain. He then crouched and jumped, casting a quick flight spell and rushing straight at the exit. The primordial beast screeched in anger,
increasing its pace. The Guardian suddenly teleported in front of Zorian, blocking his path and forcing him to evade and block another series of white beams that chased after him, pivoting in the air and curving their trajectories to keep him in their sights. Some of the other loopers helped him out, ignoring their own safety to block some of the beams with their own spells. The ceiling shook again, this time more severely than before, but Damon's final sacrifice had allowed things to keep working for now. He was only inches from the exit when the primordial beast suddenly opened its massive bestial mouth and fired some kind of serrated bony spike straight at his chest. He was practically a spent force by this point, and could do nothing to stop the spike from slamming straight into his back and passing straight through his chest. An explosion of blood and viscera erupted out of him, his whole chest a ruined mess. Perhaps it was just him losing all sensation as death took him, but it felt to him that everything suddenly went quiet for a moment as his flight spell failed and his body began to fall to the ground, trailing blood behind it. His wound was too serious. He was dead for sure. Closing his eyes, he initiated the final contingency, separating his soul from his body. A complicated soul spell he had always kept running in the background suddenly activated, allowing him to maintain consciousness in soul form. Without hesitation, he abandoned his dying form and rushed straight into the exit in front of him. Before either the primordial beast or the guardian of the threshold could stop him, he was already through, following invisible paths that would lead him to the real world. As a soul, his ability to perceive the real world was highly limited. He followed invisible lines of space and time, racing through a tunnel he could dimly perceive in front of him. Most of his ability to navigate in this place came from the fact he had absorbed the dimensional perception of the tunneler toad and gained a considerable amount of proficiency with it in the 5 months he had spent in the Imperial Orb. Yet, that same ability was also threatening to undo everything he had accomplished. He had bound that ability to his mana reserves and his body, but his body was no more. One of the very pillars that were supposed to anchor the ability to him was gone, and his mana reserves shuddered and churned, threatening to destabilize. Should that happen, he would lose all ability to cast spells or even direct his mana. Everything would still fail in the end. He had to hold on for a little while longer. He focused tightly on keeping control over his mana reserves, even as he tried to navigate to the exit in the real world. Dimly, he felt the tunnel start to collapse behind him. Apparently Xvim and Zack had finally lost their struggle to keep the passage open. Nobody except Zorian had gone through, as far as he could tell. He drove himself to travel faster. Finally he was out. He could feel the space open up around him, the tunnel ending. For a while he was disoriented, confused about what he had to do. His mind was fuzzy. He had never spent this much time in soul form, especially not with destabilizing mana reserves. However, he eventually remembered what he had to do. He had to track down his old body. Fortunately, that was not so difficult. He had no idea where the exit had deposited him, exactly, but he and his original body shared a certain bond with each other. It was hard to cast much as a pure soul, but Zorian could do enough to craft himself a set of ghostly hands. From that point, everything became easy. A couple of divinations to lock down on the location of his old self, a couple of quick teleports to enter his room, and he was there. His old self was sleeping, blissfully unaware of the invasion. Soul Zorian did not hesitate. His soul form plunged straight into his old self's chest, causing the boy to gasp before all his body locked up as the two souls started to fight for the ownership of the body. Maybe it was quick. Maybe it was slow. Zorian had never fought a soul battle or possessed someone's body before. What he did know was that his old self never had a chance. From the moment he attacked, the ultimate outcome was never in question. He opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling of his room.
His room. Yes. Definitely his room. He rose into a sitting position and looked around. It was night. He thought he would maybe wake up when Kirill came to jump on top of him, but then he remembered that the time loop technically began much earlier than that. He placed his right palm in front of him. A ghostly orb of white light bobbed up and down just above it. The soul of his old self. He stared at it for a full 5 minutes, trying to decide what to do with it. He had considered the issue before, of course, but now that he was actually here. After a while, he closed his palm around the soul, causing it to fade away and move on to the afterlife. To do anything else seemed cruel. Then he jumped out of bed, took a look around his dark, silent room and cracked his knuckles. It was time to get to work. Chapter 092 The Scramble. In the months leading up to their disastrous exit from the time loop, Zorian and the other members of the group had entertained many different outcomes and how each of them would reflect on what they would have to do immediately after crossing over into the real world. This included the possibility of having to cross over in soul form, much like Zorian had ended up doing in the end. Theoretically, this meant that Zorian already knew what to do and how to arrange his priorities. In practice, things weren't so simple. While he had succeeded in leaving the time loop and possessing his old body, the process had a critical flaw. Their theorizing had assumed that, if Zorian executed everything correctly, he would be at his top form upon seizing his body. After all, he would possess a body that was flawlessly matched to his soul, so there shouldn't be any rejection issues that usually plague possession attempts. Having crossed over as a soul meant losing all the physical resources and information storage they had planned to bring, but at least his magic would be fully intact. In reality, he didn't even have that. The problem was the dimensional ability of the tunneler toad he had anchored to himself in the time loop. His body may have been perfectly matched to his soul, but it wasn't the body to which he had anchored the ability to. Without the life force portion of the anchor, the part located in his mana reserves couldn't persist for long, either. He was fortunate he had managed to prevent its collapse before successfully possessing his old body, or else he'd be dead right now and all the sacrifices the others had made would have been for nothing. However, once he established full control of his body, the ability anchor in his mana reserves finally gave out and unraveled completely. Unraveling a permanent enhancement like that was not a small matter. It caused him no pain, and he would not be permanently crippled by any means, but his mana reserves would be in utter turmoil for the next 4 to 5 days. An eternity, considering time was of the essence. Standing completely still in the darkness of his room, Zorian closed his eyes and sensed his mana again with a more critical eye. It was bad, but not unmanageable. A regular mage would have been completely crippled by the chaotic, unruly nature of his current mana reserves, but Zorian had honed his shaping skills to virtual perfection. Plus, he had experienced something similar before, when Quatachichul had inflicted grievous soul damage, so he had experience in how to handle these sorts of things. Slowly and carefully, he waved his hands in the air in front of him, softly muttering a spell chant. After some time, a single flawless simulacrum materialized in front of him. The simulacrum did not speak or wait for Zorian to give him a command. He knew what was asked from it. He simply walked back to the bed, lied down, closed his eyes, and focused completely on calming down the raging mana reserves they both shared. Zorian breathed a sigh of relief as he felt his mana reserves immediately stabilize into a more manageable form. Good. So long as one of his simulacrums focused all their attention on stabilizing them, his mana reserves would remain usable. It wasn't the same as him being in top form, but it would do for now. His spellcasting restored to a usable condition, he immediately threw himself into the next task before him, confirming that Zack had left the time loop and waking him up before Red Robe had a chance to assassinate him in his sleep. A critical task that would normally require him to drop everything else and rush to Ceoria, but which might be achievable through faster and cheaper methods. Quickly rummaging through his old school supplies for alchemical reagents and deconstructing a bunch of old items scattered around his room for necessary materials, Zorian constructed a simple ritual circle on the floor of his room. He then spent almost a minute performing a special long-range ritual spell. One that tapped into his marker. The same marker that he had shared with Zack. There was no guarantee that Zack still had the marker on his soul, of course, even if he had successfully left the time loop. Unlike Zorian, Zack was supposed to leave the time loop the normal way for a controller. That is to say, the guardian of the threshold would perform the transfer. For all Zorian knew, this process may have involved erasing the marker, since it was no longer necessary. However, Zorian had a suspicion that the marker was definitely going to stay embedded in Zack's soul. A suspicion that turned out to be correct when the ritual finished, and the information from it rushed into Zorian's mind. He could feel the existence of the second marker in the direction of Ceoria, shining like a star in the darkness. He breathed a sigh of relief. He had made it out. There was no reason why he wouldn't have, but so many things had gone wrong that Zorian did not dare take anything for granted. He then reached out to Zack over the faint connection provided by the ritual and their identical markers. His mana reserves dropped like a stone. Bridging the vast distances between Surin and Ceoria was hard and costly, even for such a small thing. Without the two identical markers connecting them, it would have been entirely impossible. Just before he was about to run out of mana, he succeeded in touching Zack's soul. It was just a light brush, but it was enough. A sharp spiritual jolt shook his soul, shocking him awake. After observing things for a second to make sure he had really succeeded, Zorian broke the connection and stood up. He couldn't actually talk to Zack through a spell like that, so there was no point in burning through his mana to keep the link going. They would talk more once they actually met. He waited for a while till his mana reserves recovered and then cast the simulacrum spell 3 more times. Like the first simulacrums, these ones did not bother speaking either. There was no point. Zorian's connection with his simulacrum was very strong, intertwining them on both mental and spiritual levels. Though they still had their own individual minds, they were constantly exchanging thoughts with Zorian and each other, much of it on a purely unconscious level with no need to expend effort or concentration to make it happen. 4 simulacrums. This was the most he could manage at the moment while still remaining effective. He would be casting a lot of magic in the near future, so he had to keep his mana regeneration rate at acceptable levels. He considered what to do next for a moment, mentally bouncing ideas back and forth between his simulacrums. While they talked, they silently wandered around the house and rummaged through his belongings, gathering materials. They didn't have too much time to spend on making equipment, but some basic spell aids and disguises were a must. The chance that Red Robe and Silver Lake would target his family immediately after exiting the time loop was low, in his opinion. Those two had more pressing issues to tackle for now, and Surin was far from Ceoria. Red Robe might not even know about Zorian and where he lived, or else he would have knocked Zorian out of the loop before leaving it. Silver Lake obviously did know, but she and Red Robe presumably did not know each other before now and would struggle to establish trust. Nonetheless, Zorian knew he couldn't just leave his family undefended. He had to either move them to a secure place or leave a simulacrum behind to protect them. Gathering them up and moving them to some distant area was the safest option. The most responsible option. However, that would be a lengthy and mana-expensive task, and many critical tasks would have to be postponed until it was done. He couldn't make that choice. Xvim. Alanik. All the temporary loopers that had died to keep the exit open instead of trying to save their own lives. They had made that choice because they trusted him to look after everyone's interests once outside. He couldn't just blow everything off in order to make sure his family was perfectly protected. Plus, he was ultimately a bit selfish. Evacuating the house would require him to inform his parents about what was happening or use mental compulsions on them. He didn't want to do either. He wanted some semblance of normalcy to remain between them for now. If possible, he wanted to just wait for them to leave for Cuth as they normally did. In just a few days, his parents would be on a ship at sea and all but unreachable. The problem of their safety was ultimately self-solving. It was unreasonable, perhaps, but he still held on to a tiny sliver of hope that all this could be solved without informing the whole world. He shook his head, forcibly banishing his idle thoughts and fears for the future. It wasn't the time. Just as it wasn't the time to be shaken by the death of people that had been working with him on this project for more than a year. He'd worry about that later. A little while later, all the preparations were finished and he was back in his room. He glanced at the simulacrum to his left, and his copy silently nodded at him before wandering off to secure the house. Surin was not a magically potent area, and the materials he had at his disposal left a lot to be desired, but it should be enough. He would have to appropriate a fair portion of the family silverware, though. For a second, Zorian stared at the two remaining simulacrums in front of him. 4 simulacrums. But he could really only use 2 of them. So inefficient. Still, one had to work with what they had, not what they wished they had. He silently told the 2 to get ready, and then all 3 of them started to cast a powerful teleportation spell. Moments afterward, they were enveloped by a ripple in space and disappeared. Lying on the bed, the first simulacrum did not even twitch at their departure. He was wholly consumed in his task, knowing that if his attention lapsed even slightly over the next couple of hours, it could spell disaster for everything they were trying to accomplish. Having their mana reserves suddenly turn chaotic in the middle of a critical moment could kill the original or dispel one of his fellow simulacrums before they could accomplish their goals. Fortunately, Zorian's research into mental enhancements had taught him how to assume some very useful states of mind, or else he likely wouldn't have been able to maintain focus over such long periods of time. The final iteration of the month had not started auspiciously, but Zorian and his simulacrums were determined to make it work anyway. Break, Sioria was fairly easy to teleport to, since there was a teleport beacon placed in the middle of the city. Though the real purpose of the construction was to redirect all incoming teleportation into one specific area, so that they could be more easily monitored and policed, it also acted as a sort of lighthouse for teleportation magic. This meant that while Red Robe and Silver Lake would find it very inconvenient and mighty expensive to travel to a small rural town like Surin, it was relatively easy and cheap for Zorian to teleport himself towards Sioria. The moment he and his 2 simulacrums had arrived into the city, they each split off to pursue their own tasks. For simulacrum number 3, that meant checking up on theirs. After all, there was a good chance that Red Robe was actually theirs, in which case he would probably try to get his old self out of the line of fire as soon as possible. Probably. Whatever the case, visiting Jarnik's place to see what was happening there was of very high importance in Zorian's mind. The simulacrum moved rapidly through the streets of Sioria, using his own 2 feet to move around instead of wasting mana on teleportation. He wore a featureless white mask over his face and his other features were hidden with heavy clothing and layers of privacy wards. The original and the other simulacrum similarly hid their identity. It was likely they would come face to face with Red Robe at some point, and there was no point in making things easy for him by openly identifying themselves as Zorian Kaczynski. Silver Lake knew who Zorian was, of course,
But she was also an untrusting bitch, and it might take a while for her and Red Robe to set aside their differences and start working together. If Zorian could keep his identity secret for a few extra hours with his disguise, he would not consider this a wasted effort. As he approached Jornik's house, the simulacrum grew more cautious. He slowed his pace, circling the house wearily. He knew how to bypass the house wards, of course. He'd done it dozens of times, by now. However, if Red Robe was really here, he had likely modified or upgraded those just in case. It's what Zorian himself would have done, and there was no reason to assume Red Robe had been any less cautious. His paranoia soon proved itself well warranted. As he studied the house wards, he noticed they had been subtly changed. He was lucky, or maybe unlucky, because this was pretty damning proof of Red Robe's activity. 5 minutes later, the simulacrum managed to get past the defenses and entered the house. What greeted him was eerie silence. The house was dark and abandoned, and it only took a few moments for the simulacrum to realize that both Veyers and Jornik were gone. Walking around the place, the simulacrum could see numerous signs of frantic activity scattered around the place: closets and cabinets flung open, drawers ripped out of their sockets, piles of clothes and small items scattered all over the floor. It wasn't just that Veyers and Jornik were gone, they had gathered up anything of real worth from the house before leaving. This was an evacuation, not a kidnapping. The simulacrum cast a number of divination spells, trying to see if he could get some clues about where the two had gone, but failed to find anything. That was to be expected, though. It would have been shockingly incompetent of Red Robe to leave a trail behind him as he evacuated the place. The simulacrum stood in the living room of the abandoned house, fiddling with a small white statuette of a dragon that he found on the floor, lost in thought for a while. Did this prove that Veyers was Red Robe? Well, not exactly. But it did prove that he was connected to him somehow. Jornik was also gone, which could mean a lot of things. Maybe the lawyer was the real Red Robe. Admittedly, the Red Robe that Zorian met in the past was roughly his own height and thus a poor match for Jornik, who was a fully grown man, but that could be accomplished easily through shape-shifting. Or maybe the time-looping Veyers just appreciated what the older man had done for his old self and so had taken him to safety as well. Whatever the case, they were all gone now, and there was little point in staying here when there were so many other things to be done. He thought about torching the whole place out of spite, but it was better not to escalate things for now. Red Robe clearly cared a lot for these two, so burning down Jornik's place might genuinely anger him. Sure, they were already irreconcilable enemies, but doing this would make things personal. He might go after Zorian's friends and family sooner than he otherwise would have. Before he moved on, the simulacrum quickly contacted the original and the other copy to find out what was happening on their end. They were both currently fighting and couldn't talk much. Should he go help them? No. The whole point of creating so many simulacrums was to pursue many different goals simultaneously. He would just have to trust the other two would be able to complete their task on their own. Instead he went north, towards Nyazov Vary. It was time to see what Silver Lake was up to. Break. While simulacrum number 3 was checking out Jornik's house, number 4 had rushed into the tunnels beneath Seoria to contact the Arania living beneath the city. Once, the Seorian web had been his closest allies. They had taught him how to control his telepathic abilities, helped him make sense of the invasion, and provided a semblance of companionship in a world where most things were painfully short-lived. Spear of Resolve, the Iranian matriarch, had intended to betray him in the end. But he was still devastated when they were all erased out of the time loop. Part of his desire to see them as soon as possible was definitely emotional. Everything he knew about the time loop suggested they would be alive and well out here in the real world,
but he had to see that with his own eyes. In his mind, he couldn't help but draw parallels between the Aranya and the temporary loopers that had sacrificed themselves so that he could cross over into the real world. He needed some good news right now. However, there was also a practical side to his visit. Zack and Zorian were quite capable of dismantling the entire invasion in a matter of days, halting it in its tracks. But that was without Red Robe's interference. Plus, who could forget Silver Lake was also working against them? Thus, the idea of just quickly shutting down the invasion was untenable. However, this did not mean they would just sit back and do nothing about them. If they wanted to do serious damage to the invaders, the best time to do so was right now, at the very beginning of the month, before Red Robe and Silver Lake had a chance to warn all their allies about the danger. They had to move quickly, and it meant recruiting helpers. And the Zorian Aranya were one of the few powerful groups that Zorian felt they could win over to their side very quickly. Apparently Red Robe agreed with his assessment, because when Simulacrum No. 4 arrived on the outskirts of the Iranian settlement he found them locked in a desperate battle against Red Robe. The battle had clearly been raging for quite some time. Mutilated Iranian bodies and arachnoid viscera lay scattered everywhere, and several of the caves and tunnels had been collapsed by both sides in an attempt to get rid of the other. A choking cloud of dust lingered in the air, reducing visibility. Red Robe was just as Zorian remembered him. A bright red robe covered him completely, hiding most of his features, and a patch of magical darkness obscured his face. His movements were unhurried and methodical, though instead of painlessly and instantly killing the Aranya in front of him he mostly relied on various force spells to crush them and cut them apart. The sight of him fearlessly advancing forward like an invincible juggernaut and killing Aranya in very brutal and bloody ways was probably very intimidating to the spiders. Zorian suspected Red Robe was trying to crush their will to fight and scatter them before he ran out of mana. Simulacrum No. 4 quickly realized that Red Robe in front of him was a simulacrum, just like him. It made sense, really. Much like Zorian had created a bunch of copies to perform several tasks simultaneously, Red Robe had likely done the same. He immediately rushed into the battle, firing a powerful incineration ray at Red Robe's back. The other simulacrum did not show any signs of surprise, as if he had fully expected the interruption. He simply turned to the side in a smooth, practice motion, blocking both Zorian's spell and one from a nearby Aranya. Simulacrum No. 4 did not speak, and neither did his opponent. They simply circled each other and kept launching probing spells at one another, testing each other's skills and spell selection. The simulacrum was a bit disappointed at Red Robe's silence. Based on his previous experiences with the third time looper, he had expected Red Robe to try and strike up a conversation or start monologuing. That could have given Zorian an opportunity to figure something out about his opponent and his goals. Probably why he was staying silent. Oh well. The Aranya did not interfere in their fight much. Some of the angrier ones, who had lost friends and family members to the assault, kept trying to launch surprise attacks at Red Robe whenever they spotted an opening. Many of those ended up dying, since their attacks exposed them to Red Robe's retaliation. Zorian tried to keep Red Robe too occupied to focus on the Aranya much, but there was only so much he could do. Thankfully, most of the Aranya had had the common sense to pull back deeper into their settlement to regroup and recover their strength. After a while of this sort of spell exchange, Red Robe suddenly stopped. He appeared indecisive for a moment, as if he wanted to say something, but he eventually just shook his head minutely and reached for a short spell rod on his belt. Zorian tensed and prepared for the fight to escalate, but it turned out he had misjudged the situation. The rod was a simple recall spell. The moment Red Robe touched it, his body blurred for a second and then he was gone. Zorian's simulacrum did not try to pursue. He was here to save the Arania and recruit them as allies, not to take out a disposable pawn that Red Robe could recreate in a couple of minutes. This was already a victory. He relaxed and waited for the Arania to approach him, reasoning that trying to be proactive wouldn't be a good idea at the moment. He may have saved them, but the Arania were still obviously tense and might lash out if they felt pressured. Thankfully, he did not have to wait long. It took less than 2 minutes for the Arania to assemble a welcoming party that cautiously approached him. They were visibly surprised when he responded to their greetings with telepathy and fumbled in indecision when he asked to talk to Spear of Resolve. The matriarch was true to her name, however. She quickly interrupted the talks and announced she would be arriving to talk to him personally, brushing aside the outraged protests of her subordinates. Soon he was standing in front of her again, the 2 guards she brought along standing behind her and giving him their best menacing looks. To most people, she would doubtlessly look like any other Arania, a giant black jumping spider, same as any other. For the simulacrum, though, the sight brought back a flood of memories rushing to his mind. He wanted to punch her right in that big-eyed, manipulative face, but also hug her and tell her he was glad to see her. This was probably similar to how Zack had felt upon seeing him on Sioria's train station, so long ago. Except that he had much better impulse control than Zack and wasn't going to punch her. Or hug her, for that matter. "Greetings, friend," Spear of Resolve said politely. "I am grateful for the help you provided us in our hour of need. We are not ungrateful people and will surely find something to reward you with, but I sense there is more to this visit than just this." "True," the simulacrum sent back. "We have many things to talk about." The matriarch tapped her front legs against the ground curiously. "Curious." There was a curious note of nostalgia bleeding over into your messages, she pointed out. "Ah. Sorry about that," he said, wincing slightly. "I can't help it. You don't remember this, but we knew each other." "Oh. I find that very hard to believe," the matriarch said. "It's true," the copy insisted. "We worked quite closely in the past." The matriarch sent him a note of patronized amusement. "I have a very good memory when it comes to people, and you seem like a very noteworthy person. I would surely remember if I'd had the fortune to meet a mage of your caliber," she said. "In particular, the level of control you have over your gift would immediately make you stand out in the sea of people I have met over the years." An entirely reasonable argument. Sadly, the simulacrum didn't have time to take things slowly and delicately guide the matriarch to the correct conclusion. He decided to take a risk and be totally blunt. "I come from the future," he told her. The matriarch was silent for a moment. Several other Arania in the vicinity shifted in place from either amusement or incredulousness. They were clearly listening in on their conversations through their link with the matriarch. Nothing out of Zorian's expectations, really. "That's quite a claim you're making, friend," the matriarch said. She seemed more intrigued than dismissive, which surprised Zorian a little. He supposed that, even if she did not take his claim seriously, she wanted to hear his clarification. "Zorian Kaczynski," said the simulacrum, taking off his mask as a show of trust. "If this worked, he would be working closely with these people anyway. You can just call me Zorian." "Zorian, then," the matriarch agreed. "Zorian, you surely realize that great claims like that require great proof to be taken seriously?" Zorian no longer had the matriarch's memory packets, which meant that the method he used to employ to get her cooperation in the past was no longer possible. However, that was okay. He had other means of catching her attention. "Of course I do," the simulacrum said. "I can even show you my memories of the timeline I came from." "Come now, Zorian," the matriarch scolded. "Any memory you show me could be fabricated entirely. That proves nothing." Not quite, the copy responded, a small grin on his face. If I showed you some random scene with little relation to you, then yes, it could easily be a forgery. But what if I showed you a detailed map of your inner settlement, including the insides of your secret research room and your treasury? What if I demonstrated detailed knowledge about your secret research and your trading networks, the sort of things only your most respected elders have access to? What if I told you the names of every area that makes up your web, described what the insides of your private rooms look like, and demonstrated I could mimic the speech patterns and personality traits of a great many of your subordinates? Such things do not necessarily prove I come from the future, but certainly prove something, no? How could I possibly know that? The matriarch's legs began to twitch uncontrollably. A small commotion broke out among the areas surrounding them. The simulacrum could tell there was a heated discussion going on in the background. Enough, Spear of Resolve suddenly said, speaking up verbally for the first time since the meeting began. Obviously she wanted the simulacrum to hear this too. But honored matriarch. One of the guards protested. I've decided, she said firmly, spinning around in place to stare down the guard, who shrank back at her admonishment. She then turned back towards the simulacrum. I'll open my mind to you, the matriarch said telepathically. Show me these memories of yours. Zorian's copy did just that. He tapped into the stored memories inside his head, reproducing them as best as he was able. For several hours the Arania watched in uncomfortable silence as the simulacrum laid their closely guarded secrets bare to them. He showed them his conversations with Spear of Resolve, Novelty and the various guards and ambassadors he had interacted with in the past. By the time he was finally done, the matriarch was clearly disturbed at the amount of information he possessed. It was as the simulacrum had said, it wasn't ironclad proof that he was from the future, but it did mean he had access to just about everything about them at some point. That was disturbing enough on its own. This. How could you possibly know all of this? The matriarch asked hesitantly. She usually tried to project an air of certainty and confidence when interacting with him, even when she was secretly bothered behind the facade. There was none of that now, however. Even if you're from the future, even if we worked together in this future, I would never. You died, Zorian's copy told her bluntly, cutting her off. You all died. That cloaked man that just attacked you earlier? In the future I know. I was not strong enough. Oh, the matriarch said, deflating. You were supposedly allied with us, but you searched our city for anything of value the moment we died, one of the Arania elder interjected, accusation clear in her voice. You would have done the same in my place, he said, wholly unrepentant. The Arania said nothing to that. I am curious, the matriarch eventually said, picking her words carefully. If I were to just tell you to go away and refuse to have anything to do with you, what would you do, almighty time traveler? I would respect your decision, the simulacrum shrugged. Truly? The matriarch asked, sounding very skeptical. Why not? I would just go to one of the other Iranian webs in the area, Zorian's copy said. It's not like you're the only Iranian web that I worked with. Every area in the room suddenly became very quiet and still. And simulacrum number 4 could not help but smile smugly, for he knew he had them. Break. While the two simulacrums pursued their own tasks elsewhere in the city, the original had what was arguably the most important task of all. He had to check up on Zack and help him if he was in danger. He wouldn't put it past Red Robe and Silver Lake to focus on killing him as their very first priority. It's what Zorian would have done in their place, after all. His fears turned out to have been only half right. When he arrived at the Nevada estate, he found the place on fire and racked with explosions. Destructive beams punched straight through the thick, warded walls of the building, triggering various alarms and countermeasures. Clearly an attack on Zack was already in progress. It was good that he had woken up his fellow time traveler with that ritual, or else Zack would have probably met a quick and ignoble end at the hand of his attackers. Well, attacker, singular. When he reached the site of the battle itself, he only found Red Robe fighting Zack. Silver Lake was nowhere to be seen. Very curious. Even if she was wary of Red Robe, she should have at least cooperated with him on this. In any case, this Red Robe was the same as the one that had attacked the area in the tunnels below. It was just a simulacrum. Once Zorian joined the fight, this second simulacrum seemed to realize the attack had failed and that persisting would just waste mana, so it just dismissed itself. What an underwhelming outcome. What was Red Robe doing, if he was so wary of really committing himself anywhere? He didn't like this. He really didn't like this. He turned towards Zack and winced. He hadn't noticed it while he had been fighting Red Robe's simulacrum, but the other boy had a large bleeding gash across the chest. Hey, Zack panted. Thanks for the wake-up call back there. If you had been just a moment late, I would have probably never woken up. His knees gave out suddenly, causing him to tip over. Zorian quickly rushed forward and caught him just before he was going to slam headfirst into the floor. Shit. Zorian swore, inspecting the wound. His medical magic was a joke, but he could at least assess the severity of an open wound like this one. You lost so much blood there. How were you even standing for so long? It's not the first time. Zack gasped, pressing his trembling fingers over the wound. The bleeding immediately lessened somewhat. I'll live. Zorian sighed. He would live, sure. But he would be pretty much incapacitated for the next day or two, even with the best medical care in the country. This was terrible news. I'm glad you made it out, Zack said with a trembling voice. Don't speak, Zorian told him telepathically, picking him up like a baby. Well, he tried to, at least. Picking up another person was a little bit too much for him, so he first had to cast some spells to lighten the load, but he managed it in the end. He then immediately set off in the direction of the nearest hospital. You're going to aggravate your wound. Also, damn you're heavy. I'm doing you a favor, Zack responded back. Didn't you say you wanted to work out more when we get out? Not like this, you asshole, Zorian grumbled. Wait. Zack suddenly frowned. You're wounded too. Zorian gave him an incredulous look. What? Oh. No, Zorian said. My mana is in chaos because the Tunneler Toad's dimensional perception ability unraveled when I abandoned my body back in the time loop. It was scary how perceptive Zack was sometimes. Zorian didn't even think he was showing any signs of mana instability on the outside, but clearly he was wrong. Oh yeah, Zack said, immediately calming down. Still, doesn't that mean I'll be held back in what I can do for at least a couple of days? Yes, Zorian confirmed. Damn it. Nothing ever goes right about this. Zack raged. I wouldn't say that, Zorian said. He tracked down the nearest potion store and teleported them both towards it. It was closed at this time of day, but breaking in was a simple matter. He idly wondered whether a medical emergency like this counted as a valid reason to perform a burglary, but then decided he didn't care. He would anonymously pay the shopkeeper back for the damages he caused. I'm sure Red Robe is feeling pretty aggrieved right now. He almost had you, but he failed in the end. Plus, my simulacrum just stopped him from getting rid of the area beneath the city. He quickly picked up the most powerful wound-closing and blood-replenishing potions in the store and fed them to Zack, who immediately showed a positive reaction. His skin got back some of its color and the wound seemingly closed, though Zorian knew it was still very much present beneath the surface. Zack immediately tried to get up on his own 2 feet, the idiot. He collapsed back immediately, having aggravated his wound. "Let's just get you to the nearest hospital, all right?" Zorian said, face-palming at the sight. "Zorian, listen," Zack said. "When you left through the exit and the time loop reset itself, I lingered behind for a bit. Just to see what would happen to you and Silver Lake over the next few restarts, you know?" Zorian raised his eyebrow at him. "And? You were back," Zack said. "Both of you. You didn't remember anything about the time loop, but you were walking and talking as normal. You were just like any other person stuck in the time loop, unaware of the passage of time past the summer festival. Man, talking to your old self was freaky, I tell you. I all but forgot how unfriendly and sensitive you were back then. Did I tell you I'm really glad you made it out in the end?" "You did," Zorian confirmed. "Oh yeah. What did you do with the—" Zack started to ask, before being cut off by Zorian. "I killed him," Zorian said curtly. "Sent his soul to the afterlife." Shit," Zack fumbled. "That's kind of brutal. What was I supposed to do?" Zorian asked, uncomfortable with this line of questioning. "I don't know how to make a new body for him. Maybe I never will. I'd have to either keep him in stasis for years and years before finally releasing him into an alien world where a stranger has usurped his life, or having him accompany me as a powerless ghost looking over my shoulder, constantly getting his face rubbed in at the fact I'm so much better than him at everything. Isn't that a cruel and horrifying fate to inflict on someone?" "I don't know," Zack admitted after a while. "I know I'm not the same person as him by this point," Zorian said quietly, "but I would hate that with every fiber of my being. I don't think I'd ever get over it. Maybe I'm just a selfish monster trying to justify my crimes, but I think I'm doing him a favor. Alanik says the afterlife is still a thing, even after the gods stop talking to people. For all his faults, I don't think the old Zorian had done anything truly heinous in his life. There should be a good outcome waiting for him there. Something he'd never get back here with us." There was an awkward silence for a few seconds, and then Zorian cracked his knuckles before picking Zack up again. "Thank the gods for lightning spells. I don't want to talk about this," Zorian admitted. "Let's just get you to a hospital and call it a day. We'll just have to leave the rest to our simulacrums. Now that I think about it, maybe Red Robe is onto something by only sending simulacrums to tackle problems and never appearing in person. Sure, it makes him more likely to fail and get beaten back, but it also makes every failure more inconsequential." He babbled about all sorts of things as he walked through the city. He was mostly out of mana by this point, since pretty much all his simulacrums had been tapping into them for their own purposes, so he couldn't simply teleport to the hospital. However, it was fine. Zack had stopped bleeding by this point, so he wasn't going to die anytime soon. He should make use of this breather to make some golem simulacrums and replace the current ectoplasmic ones with them. Of course, the golem simulacrums were expensive, so he would have to raid some of the Ebus and caches for money and materials. Plus, he needed a proper workshop and he suddenly stopped inside internally. So many things to do. So little time and mana to play with. The only thing that made him feel better was that Red Robe and Silver Lake were probably faced with choices just as difficult as theirs. Hopefully they had chosen their priorities better than their opponents. Break. When Simulacrum number 3 arrived at the spot of Silver Lake's hideout, he found no signs of fighting or forced entry in the vicinity. However, that did not actually tell him much. For all he knew, Silver Lake had some kind of secret entrance into her pocket dimension, and could simply walk in any time she pleased. Wards be damned. Hell, perhaps the old Silver Lake had simply let her in. It was hardly a given that the two would fight to the death once they met. It all depended on whether the time looper Silverlake wanted to kill her old self to take her life and belongings back, or if she wanted to recruit her into her plans. Or maybe she intended to simply ignore her old self entirely. After all, simply coming here was highly dangerous, since Zack and Zorian knew about this place, and it was an obvious place to set up an ambush for her. Anyway, the first task Simulacrum 3 currently faced was checking if the old Silverlake was still alive and inside. If she was, then he needed to know if the time looper Silverlake had already visited her and tried to recruit her. To find that out, he could rely on slowly using exotic divination on her hideout while carefully avoiding being found out. But that would take a lot of time and mana, and he didn't want to bother. Instead he simply made an unearthly racket just out of her pocket dimension, screaming obscenities at the treacherous old witch until she decided to come out to confront him. Which she did. She stomped out of the pocket dimension, visibly fuming and glaring at him. The simulacrum immediately decided she probably hadn't been visited by her time looper self. She had approached him too carelessly, like she had no idea what he was capable of. She would have been far more cautious if the other Silverlake had warned her about him. Still, he had to make sure. "Boy, what the hell are you shouting for?" Silverlake shouted, stopping some distance away from him. "Coming here in the dead of the night, at 3 in the morning, shouting all these obscenities at a poor old woman like me. What is the world coming to these days? Haven't your parents taught you to respect your elders? Bow down and apologize or I'm going to poison your whole family, you hear me? I just wanted to get your attention," the simulacrum told her honestly. That only made her angrier. "Listen, I'm kind of in a hurry. Did you perhaps get visited lately by an ugly old crone that looks just like you?" Silverlake raised her hand and fired a weak lightning bolt. Well, relatively speaking, since that spell could have inflicted serious damage to a normal person. Zorian's simulacrum, though, he simply copied his mentor's Veem and backhanded the lightning bolt to the side. Rather than char his hand, the bolt was deflected harmlessly into the nearby ground, creating a small crater in the forest soil. Silverlake's posture instantly changed, becoming warrior and more alert. "No, seriously. Did someone who looks just like you visit you recently and try to kill you or recruit you? Someone who knows all your secrets and abilities?" he again asked. "Who are you?" Silverlake said, her eyes narrowing suspiciously and her hands twitching with half-formed spells. The simulacrum clacked his tongue. She was totally ignorant of everything, he was sure of it. Time looper Silverlake had not visited this place. But why? Did she really not care about her old self, or was she just being paranoid? He hadn't arrived here particularly quickly. If Silverlake wanted to travel here from Cioria, she would have arrived way before he did. In all likelihood, she would have finished up before he had a chance to get here and intercept her. "Hey! Are you deaf or something?" Silverlake shouted, kicking a nearby stone in his direction. It was surprisingly accurate, flying straight at his forehead. She had a pretty good kick. Of course, Zorian just dodged the stone with practiced ease, so it ultimately amounted to nothing. He could kill her, he realized. Even if time looper Silverlake wanted her dead, there was no guarantee that old Silverlake would be grateful to them once they saved her. She was an incredibly cynical person, and would simply see two young fools she could exploit to her advantage. She might work with them out of a sense of self-preservation, but she would be constantly looking for an angle to exploit and probably wouldn't want to do anything that placed her into significant danger. What was the point of such an ally? "Here. Catch," he said, throwing a small stone disc at her. She did not bother catching it, simply stepping back and letting it hit the ground. She then used a nearby fallen branch to suspiciously poke at it. The simulacrum rolled his eyes at her. "What the hell is this thing?" she asked. "It's an illusion stone," the simulacrum said. "I recorded a rather interesting scene in it. You can study it later in the privacy of your own abode. Oh, and by the way, you should probably change your warding scheme as soon as possible. You should also collapse any secret entrances into your place, even if you think you're the only one who knows about them." He turned to leave. "Now wait just a moment here, you little brat. You're just going to leave without explaining any of the crap you just unloaded into my lap?" Silver Lake demanded. "Yes," Zorian's copy nodded. "I decided not to kill you. Don't make me regret it, alright?" Before she could respond, he teleported away. He didn't want to linger around Silver Lake's place. While setting up an ambush around her hideout might have seemed like a good way to get the time-looping version of her, Zorian felt something wasn't right there. He had to make sure Anik, Kel and Lekave were fine. Silver Lake could wait. Break. While Zorian and the other simulacrums were teleporting around and cracking their heads to figure out what the enemy was planning, simulacrum number 2 was bored. His job was to secure the house and watch out for Red Robe or Silver Lake staging an attack on his family. However, he had already done all he could to secure the house and no attack was happening. The hours passed, and eventually he found himself in front of Kirill's room. The morning was already here, wasn't it? Didn't that mean it was about time for Kirill to wake up? He rubbed his hands sinisterly, an evil grin on his face. It had been so long since he had a chance to wake up Kirill. He liked to sleep in, and the time loop never really changed that, so it was usually her that woke him up. He entered her room and crouched next to her bed. She was covered up to her neck in a blanket, with only her face visible. She was blissfully unaware of Zorian crouching next to her, a look of peace and contentment on her face. The simulacrum considered how he should go about doing this. Jumping on her, like she liked to do to him, had an air of poetic justice on it. However, it didn't feel right. He was too big and heavy, and it would be a bit too much for a prank. Dropping a bucket of water on her like she had when she had thought he was a shapeshifter? No, that would get the bed wet and Mother would freak out on him. Oh well, he'd just go with the classic. "Good morning, sister," he suddenly shouted in her ear. "Morning, morning, morning." She woke up screaming and flailing, and eventually fell out of the bed. He laughed at her. "Ah, he needed that. Zorian, you jerk," she shouted at him, flailing her little arms at him like a windmill. She was like a little angry kitten, though, so it just made him laugh harder. She eventually kicked him out of the room so she could switch out of her pajamas. Once she was out, she gave him a curious look. "How come you're awake?" she asked. "I couldn't sleep," the simulacrum said. "Oh," she said. She looked at him hopefully. "Hey, can you show me some magic? Please?" He spent the next half an hour entertaining Kirill, casting various spells for her amusement, until the original contacted him and told him to stop wasting mana on frivolities like that. What a jerk. The mana drain on those illusions was totally negligible. He watched Kirill deflate when he told her he had to go pack and couldn't play with her anymore. She looked like she wanted to ask him something but eventually just chickened out, staring at the floor like a kicked puppy instead. He sighed internally. He knew what she wanted to ask, of course. She wanted him to take her to see Oreo with him. But doing that would be irresponsible, short-sighted, stupid. He watched Kirill for a few more seconds, remembering all the promises he made to his little sister over the many restarts he shared with her. He promised he wouldn't forget her. He promised he would teach her magic. He promised he would bring her with him to see Oreo.
Just as she was about to run off, Zorian placed his hand on her shoulder, causing her to halt in her tracks and look at him in surprise. Her lip quivered slightly. "Hey, Kirill," he told her with a mischievous smile. "Do you want to come with me to Sioria?" Simulacrum number 2 could practically imagine Zorian screaming at him in the near future, explaining in great detail what an idiot he was being. He didn't care, though. The smile on her face when he asked her that question made it all worth it. Tobe continued,